I never thought my emergency road kit would become the center of a legal nightmare. But when Brenda from the Homeowners Association decided my safety flares violated some obscure aesthetic code during the worst storm of the decade, she set off a chain of events that would land her in handcuffs by the end of the week. The whole mess started on a Tuesday afternoon in Wilmington, North Carolina. Hurricane season had been brutal that year, and meteorologists were tracking what they called a rapidly intensifying coastal system that was supposed to slam into our area by evening. I had just gotten home from my job at the maritime logistics company downtown, and my wife Patricia was already boarding up the windows of our modest two-story colonial in the Magnolia Springs subdivision. "Isaac, did you check the car?" Patricia called from the ladder where she was securing the last piece of plywood over our living room window. "Just about to," I said, heading toward the garage. Our neighborhood sat about 3 miles inland, far enough from the coast to avoid mandatory evacuation, but close enough that flooding was a serious concern. The drainage in Magnolia Springs had always been questionable at best, and with the forecast calling for 8 to 12 inches of rain, I wanted to make sure we could get out if we needed to. I popped the trunk of my Toyota Camry and did a quick inventory. Jumper cables, check. First aid kit, check. Emergency flares, still in their weatherproof case where I had placed them 2 months ago. The flares were the good kind, the ones that burned for 30 minutes each and could be seen from a mile away. I had bought them after Patricia, and I got stranded on Highway 17 during a summer thunderstorm, and I swore I would never be caught unprepared again. The wind was already picking up, rattling the garage door and sending leaves skittering across the driveway. Dark clouds rolled overhead like a bruise spreading across the sky. I was about to close the trunk when I heard the sharp click of heels on concrete. "Isaac Benjamin," a voice called out, nasal and sharp enough to cut glass. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. Brenda Whitmore, president of the Magnolia Springs Homeowners Association, and the bane of every resident who dared to plant the wrong color flowers or leave their trash cans out 5 minutes past collection time. I turned to find her standing at the edge of my driveway, clutching a plastic-covered binder to her chest like a shield. Brenda was 53 years old with a blonde bob that never moved in the wind, and a wardrobe that consisted entirely of pastel cardigans and khaki pants. Her lips were pursed in what I had come to recognize as her permanent state of disapproval. "Brenda," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Little busy right now with the storm coming." "This will only take a moment," she said, tottering toward me on her sensible pumps. Her eyes locked onto my open trunk, and I saw them narrow. "Are those emergency flares?" "Yes, they are. Safety equipment for the car." She flipped open her binder with the efficiency of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Section 12. Paragraph 4 of the HOA covenants clearly states that all hazardous materials must be stored inside the primary dwelling or in an approved storage facility. Motor vehicles do not qualify as approved storage facilities. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. "Brenda, these are emergency road flares. They are designed to be stored in vehicles. That is literally their purpose." "Hazardous materials," she repeated, tapping a manicured finger against the laminated page. "The association takes safety very seriously, Isaac. What if your car caught fire? Those flares could explode and endanger the entire neighborhood." "That is not how flares work," I said, struggling to keep my temper in check. The wind gusted again, and I felt the first fat drops of rain hit my face. "And in case you have not noticed, we have a hurricane bearing down on us." "I need those flares in case of emergency." "The rules exist for a reason," Brenda said primly. I am going to have to issue you a citation. You have 24 hours to remove the hazardous materials from your vehicle or face a $500 fine. You cannot be serious, deadly serious. The safety of this community is my responsibility. She produced a pre-printed citation form from her binder and began filling it out with a pen she pulled from behind her ear. The rain was coming down harder now, and I saw her glance nervously at the sky. I will need you to sign here acknowledging receipt. I am not signing anything, I said flatly. Those flares stay in my car where they belong. Brenda's expression hardened. Then I will note your refusal to cooperate. She scribbled something on the form, tore off the yellow copy, and tried to hand it to me. When I did not take it, she set it on the hood of my car, where the rain immediately began to darken the paper. This is insane, I muttered, but she was already click-clacking back down my driveway, hunched against the wind. Patricia appeared at the door to the garage. What did she want? To fine us for having emergency flares in the car, I said, crumpling the citation and shoving it in my pocket. I swear that woman would cite her own mother for breathing too loud. Just ignore her, Patricia said. We have bigger problems right now. The news says the storm is going to hit around 10 tonight. She was right. I closed the trunk and helped Patricia move our patio furniture into the garage, then brought in anything else that could become a projectile in high winds. By 6 o'clock, the rain was coming down in sheets and the power had already flickered twice. We ate a cold dinner by flashlight and listened to the weather radio crackling with updates about the storm surge and wind speeds. Around 8, there was a sharp knock at the door. I opened it to find Brenda standing on my porch, soaked to the skin despite the oversized yellow rain poncho she wore. Her hair was plastered to her head and water dripped from her nose. I need those flares, she said without preamble. What? The emergency flares in your trunk. I need them right now. She tried to push past me into the house, but I blocked her path. Brenda, what are you talking about? Go home. The storm is getting worse. My car died at the intersection of Magnolia and Oak, she said, her voice rising to a near shriek. The water is already ankle deep and rising. I need flares to mark my vehicle so it does not get hit. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The woman who had tried to fine me for having safety equipment now wanted to confiscate that same equipment for her own use. Those flares are staying in my car, I said. Like I told you, they are emergency equipment. My emergency equipment. This is an emergency. Brenda grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. You have to help me. I am the HOA president, and I am someone who had the good sense to prepare for this storm, I said, prying her hand off my arm. Call a tow truck or the police if you need help. I am not giving you my flares. Her face contorted with rage. Fine. Then I will take them myself. Before I could react, she darted off the porch and ran toward my driveway. The rain was coming down so hard I could barely see her yellow poncho bobbing through the darkness. I heard my car alarm start blaring. Are you kidding me? I grabbed my own rain jacket and ran after her, but by the time I reached the driveway, Brenda had already smashed the passenger side window of my Camry with what looked like a decorative garden rock. She was reaching through the broken window trying to pop the trunk release. Brenda, stop. That is my property. She ignored me, finally finding the release. The trunk popped open and she lunged for it, grabbing the case of emergency flares. I tried to intercept her, but she was surprisingly fast for a woman in pumps and a poncho. She clutched the case to her chest and took off running down the street toward where she said her car was stranded. You just committed vandalism and theft. I shouted after her, but my words were lost in the howl of the wind. Patricia appeared beside me, staring at the broken window and the empty trunk. Did she just steal our flares? And smashed our window, I said, water streaming down my face. I am calling the police. In the middle of a hurricane, she had a point. I could already hear the distant wail of sirens, likely responding to actual emergencies like downed power lines and car accidents. A dispute over stolen road flares probably ranked pretty low on their priority list. I am documenting this, I said, pulling out my phone. The screen was already wet, but I managed to get several photos of the broken window and the rock Brenda had used, which still lay on my passenger seat amid the shattered safety glass. I also took photos of my driveway and the street, showing the rapidly rising water. "Come inside before you get killed by flying debris," Patricia said, tugging on my arm. "We will deal with this after the storm passes." The next few hours were tense. The power went out completely around 9:30, plunging the neighborhood into darkness broken only by occasional flashes of lightning. The wind screamed like a living thing, and I heard crashes and thuds as shingles and tree branches struck houses. Water began seeping under our front door despite the towels we had laid down, and I started to worry that we might need to retreat to the second floor. Around midnight, the worst of it passed. The rain continued, but the wind died down to a more manageable roar, and I risked opening the front door to survey the damage. The street had turned into a river, brown water rushing past at knee height. Debris floated by, everything from trash cans to what looked like someone's mailbox. I saw several cars partially submerged, their hazard lights blinking feebly under the water. One of those cars, I realized, was a silver Honda Accord that I recognized as Brenda's vehicle. It sat at the intersection just visible from my house, water up to its door handles. And surrounding it in a triangle pattern were my emergency flares, burning bright red in the darkness. "Well, at least she used them correctly," I muttered. Patricia joined me at the door. "Is that Brenda's car?" "Yeah, wonder where she went." We got our answer about an hour later when the water began to slowly recede, and I heard an engine struggling to turn over. I looked out to see Brenda in her Honda, apparently trying to start the flooded vehicle. The flares were still burning around her car, though they had to be getting close to their 30-minute limit by now. I watched as her backup lights came on, then her headlights. Somehow, impossibly, she had gotten the car started. Black smoke poured from the exhaust as the engine coughed and sputtered, but it was running. She threw the car into reverse, backing out of the deep water without bothering to collect the flares. "She is not actually going to drive in this, is she?" Patricia asked, incredulous. But that was exactly what Brenda was doing. I watched her Honda fishtail on the wet road, its taillights weaving back and forth as she accelerated away from the flares. She turned left onto Magnolia Drive, driving way too fast for the conditions, and disappeared around the corner. "She is going to get herself killed," I said. Patricia squeezed my shoulder. "Not our problem, she made her choices." But it became our problem the next morning when we ventured out to assess the damage. The broken car window was going to cost me at least $300 to replace, and that did not include the cost of replacing the stolen flares. I walked down to the intersection where Brenda's car had been stranded and found the burned-out flare casings lying in the street, along with muddy tire tracks showing where she had gunned it out of there. I was taking photos of everything when my neighbor Tom approached, carefully navigating around the puddles and fallen branches that littered the street. "Did you hear about Brenda?" he asked. "Hear what?" "She got pulled over last night during the storm. Apparently she was driving like a maniac on Highway 17, swerving all over the road. The cops thought she was drunk." I felt a grim satisfaction settle in my chest. "Did they arrest her?" "Better than that," Tom said, a grin spreading across his face. When they searched her car, they found all sorts of stuff she had apparently stolen from people's yards and garages during the storm. Garden equipment, a generator, someone's toolbox. She was looting the neighborhood while everyone was hunkered down. You are kidding. Nope. My wife heard it from Rachel down the street, whose husband is a volunteer firefighter. He was at the station when they brought Brenda in. She is facing multiple charges, including theft, vandalism, and reckless driving. Might even get hit with something about looting during a declared emergency, which is apparently a more serious charge. I thought about my stolen flares and my broken car window. She came to my house before the storm hit and demanded I give her my emergency flares. When I refused, she smashed my window and stole them anyway. Tom's eyebrows shot up. You need to tell the police. Add it to the list of charges. I spent the rest of the morning documenting everything and writing down a detailed timeline of events. By afternoon, the police had set up a makeshift command post at the elementary school to coordinate storm response and take reports of damage or crimes. I drove over there carefully, navigating around down power lines and flooded streets, and waited in line with a dozen other residents who had similar stories. The officer who took my statement was a tired-looking sergeant named Rodriguez who had clearly been up all night. He listened to my story, examined my photos, and nodded grimly. You are the third person today to report theft by Brenda Whitmore, he said. We have her in custody, but we are still trying to catalog everything we found in her vehicle and garage. Can you identify your property if we show it to you? The flares, yes. They have a specific brand marking on the case. I pulled up the product listing on my phone and showed him. Rodriguez made a note. We will be in touch. In the meantime, make sure you get a repair estimate for your car window. You will need that for restitution. Over the next few days, the full extent of Brenda's storm night crime spree came to light. Apparently, she had driven around the neighborhood in the worst of the weather, breaking into garages and sheds while people were sheltering inside their homes. She had stolen thousands of dollars worth of equipment, tools, and supplies, all while claiming to be securing hazardous materials on behalf of the HOA. The story made the local news. I watched a clip of Brenda being walked out of the police station, her blonde bob disheveled and her eyes red from crying. The reporter detailed the charges against her, which included multiple counts of felony theft, vandalism, criminal trespass, and reckless endangerment. The looting during emergency enhancement meant she was looking at serious prison time if convicted. But the part that really caught everyone's attention was the detail about how she got caught. According to the police report, an officer had pulled her over on Highway 17 around 1 in the morning during the height of the storm. She had been driving erratically, swerving across lanes, and nearly sideswiping a power company truck. When the officer approached her vehicle, he found it packed with stolen property. Brenda had tried to claim she was the HOA president and had the authority to confiscate items that violated community covenants. But her story fell apart when the officer found property from 3 different subdivisions, not just Magnolia Springs. The really ironic part was that the officer had initially stopped her because her car was smoking and appeared to be a hazard on the road. The Honda's engine had been damaged by the flooding, and she was leaving a trail of oil and coolant as she drove. If she had just stayed put and waited for help like a normal person, she probably would have gotten away with the theft. Instead, her panicked flight had led directly to her arrest. Patricia and I attended the preliminary hearing 2 weeks later. The courtroom was packed with Magnolia Springs residents, many of whom were there to either testify against Brenda or simply watch the spectacle. I saw Tom and his wife, along with Rachel and at least a dozen other neighbors I recognized. Brenda sat at the defense table with a court-appointed attorney, looking smaller and more diminished than I had ever seen her. Her trademark pastel cardigan had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit, and her hair hung limp around her face. She did not make eye contact with anyone in the gallery. The prosecutor laid out the charges methodically. 23 counts of theft, 15 counts of vandalism, 8 counts of criminal trespass, 1 count of reckless driving. The total value of stolen property exceeded $40,000. The prosecutor also noted that Brenda had violated the terms of the declared state of emergency, which made several of the charges eligible for enhanced penalties. When it was my turn to testify, I walked through the events of that Tuesday evening. I described how Brenda had first tried to cite me for having flares in my car, then returned to demand I give them to her, and finally smashed my window and stole them when I refused. I submitted the photos I had taken as evidence. Brenda's attorney tried to argue that his client had been acting in her capacity as HOA president and had genuinely believed she had the authority to confiscate items she deemed hazardous. The judge was not impressed. "Miss Whitmore," Judge Sarah Martinez said, peering over her reading glasses, "you are charged with breaking into Mr. Benjamin's vehicle and stealing his property. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Brenda said quietly. "I was just trying to protect the community. By smashing car windows and stealing emergency equipment during a hurricane. I needed those flares to mark my vehicle. It was a safety issue." Judge Martinez set down her pen and fixed Brenda with a hard stare. "According to the police report, you used those flares to mark your vehicle, then drove away and left them burning in the middle of an intersection. That hardly seems like responsible safety management." Brenda had no answer to that. The preliminary hearing concluded with the judge ruling that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Brenda's bail was set at $50,000, which she could not afford, so she remained in custody at the new Hanover County Detention Center. As Patricia and I left the courthouse, we ran into several other victims of Brenda's theft spree. A man named Richard had lost a $3,000 generator from his garage. A woman named Susan discovered that her entire collection of power tools had been stolen from her shed. An elderly couple, the Johnsons, had their backup battery system taken right out of their garage while they huddled in their basement during the storm. "I always knew she was a busybody," Richard said, shaking his head, "but I never thought she was a criminal." "Power went to her head," Susan added. "She thought being HOA president meant she could do whatever she wanted." Tom caught up with us in the parking lot. "Hey, Isaac, did you hear? The HOA board held an emergency meeting yesterday. They voted unanimously to remove Brenda as president and filed a lawsuit to recover the association's legal fees. Apparently, she used HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, too." "Of course she did," I said. "Is anyone surprised at this point?" "They want you to consider running for president," Tom continued. "You have always been level-headed about this stuff and people trust you." I held up my hands. "Absolutely not. I have had enough of HOA drama to last a lifetime." Patricia laughed. "Smart man." The trial itself took place 3 months later, in early December. The prosecution had assembled an overwhelming case against Brenda. Security camera footage from several homes showed her prowling through the neighborhood during the storm. Ring doorbell videos captured her breaking into garages and sheds. Credit card records proved she had been in financial trouble for months, which explained her motivation for the thefts. But the most damning evidence came from Brenda's own documentation. As HOA president, she had kept meticulous records of every perceived violation in the neighborhood, including photos and detailed notes. The prosecution used those records to prove that she had been casing homes for months, identifying valuable property under the guise of conducting HOA inspections. My stolen flares had been recovered from Brenda's garage, still in their case but with 3 of the 6 flares missing. The 3 she had used to mark her car that night. The burned casings had been collected from the intersection as evidence. Brenda's attorney tried to argue that she had intended to return everything after the storm, but the sheer volume of stolen property made that claim laughable. The defense's main strategy was to paint Brenda as a woman who had cracked under the stress of her HOA responsibilities. They brought in a psychologist who testified about how the pressure of managing a fractious homeowners association had affected her judgment. They portrayed her as someone who had genuinely believed she was acting in the community's best interest, even if her methods were misguided. The jury did not buy it. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, they returned with guilty verdicts on all 23 counts of theft, all 15 counts of vandalism, 7 of the 8 trespass charges, and the reckless driving charge. The only charge they could not agree on was 1 count of trespass related to a shed where the owner admitted he sometimes left it unlocked. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Patricia and I attended, along with most of the other victims. We each had the opportunity to deliver victim impact statements. When my turn came, I stood at the podium and looked directly at Brenda, who sat with her head bowed at the defense table. "Brenda, you came to my home during a declared emergency and tried to intimidate me into giving up safety equipment I might have needed to protect my family," I said. "When I refused, you committed a crime. You smashed my car window, stole my property, and put my wife and me at risk. And you did it while claiming to represent the community and enforce rules that did not even apply to the situation." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "I think what bothers me most is not the monetary value of what you stole. It is the betrayal of trust. We elected you to lead our HOA because we thought you cared about the neighborhood. Instead, you used that position to target people's homes and steal from them when they were most vulnerable. That is not leadership. That is predatory behavior." Other victims delivered similar statements. Richard talked about how the stolen generator had left his elderly mother without power for her medical equipment. Susan described the financial hardship of replacing thousands of dollars in tools she needed for her landscaping business. The Johnsons spoke tearfully about how violated they felt knowing someone had broken into their garage while they feared for their lives in the storm. When it was time for Brenda to speak, her attorney helped her to her feet. She had lost weight during her time in jail, and she looked frail in her oversized suit. "I am sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know that does not fix anything, but I am truly sorry. I never meant for things to go this far. I thought I was helping. I thought I was protecting property values and keeping the community safe. But I realize now that I let the authority go to my head. I became the thing I always claimed to hate, someone who put rules above people." She wiped at her eyes with a tissue. "I especially want to apologize to Isaac Benjamin. He was right that night. Those flares were his property, and I had no right to take them. I put him and his family at risk because I was too proud to admit I had made a mistake by driving in the storm. I should have stayed home like everyone else. I should have called for help instead of taking matters into my own hands." Judge Martinez listened impassively, then consulted her notes. "Miss Whitmore, I have reviewed the presentence report and considered all the evidence presented at trial. The crimes you committed were serious and premeditated. You did not simply make one bad decision in a moment of panic. You engaged in a systematic pattern of theft and vandalism over the course of several hours, stealing from multiple victims who trusted you as their HOA president. The judge continued, her voice stern. The law takes a particularly dim view of crimes committed during declared emergencies. When the governor declares a state of emergency, it is to protect citizens and coordinate response efforts. It is not an opportunity for criminals to exploit their neighbors' vulnerability. The fact that you held a position of trust in the community makes your crimes even more egregious. Brenda was sentenced to 6 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 4 years. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, including the costs of property replacement, repairs, and any other documented expenses. The total came to just under $47,000, which would likely take her decades to pay off given her financial situation. As the bailiff led Brenda away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Satisfaction that justice had been served, certainly. Relief that the ordeal was finally over. But also a strange sadness for how completely Brenda had destroyed her own life over what amounted to petty theft and a power trip. Patricia took my hand as we walked out of the courthouse. "How are you feeling?" "Honestly, I just want to go home and forget this whole thing ever happened." "We still need to get your window fixed," she reminded me. I laughed. "Yeah, there is that." The insurance company had already approved my claim for the broken window, and I had purchased a new set of emergency flares to replace the stolen ones. The total out-of-pocket cost was about $200 after my deductible, which Brenda would eventually have to repay as part of her restitution order. But I was not holding my breath for that money. Based on what I had learned during the trial, Brenda had been living paycheck to paycheck even before her arrest. Now, with a felony record and years of prison ahead of her, her earning potential was essentially zero. Life in Magnolia Springs slowly returned to normal over the following months. The HOA elected a new president, a retired school teacher named Margaret who took a much more common-sense approach to community management. One of her first acts was to review and revise the covenant rules, eliminating ridiculous provisions like the one about hazardous materials in vehicles. She also implemented new oversight procedures to prevent any future president from abusing their authority. The neighborhood itself recovered from the storm damage. Fallen trees were cleared, roofs were repaired, and the county finally addressed the drainage issues that had caused so much flooding. By spring, Magnolia Springs looked better than it had in years. I ran into Tom one Saturday morning while checking the mail. He was out walking his dog, a friendly golden retriever named Bailey, who immediately bounded over to greet me. "Did you hear the latest about Brenda?" Tom asked as I scratched Bailey behind the ears. "What now?" Her attorney filed an appeal last month, claims the judge gave her too harsh a sentence and that she should have been allowed to present more evidence about her mental state during the storm. I shook my head. She broke into more than 20 homes and stole $40,000 worth of stuff. What did she expect? I know, right? Some people just never learn. Tom clipped Bailey's leash back on. "Hey, you should come to the next HOA meeting. Margaret is proposing we use some of the reserve funds to install better street lighting. A few people are opposed because they think it will raise dues, but I think it makes sense from a safety perspective." "I will think about it," I said, though we both knew I probably would not attend. I had learned my lesson about getting too involved in HOA politics. That evening, Patricia and I sat on our back porch watching the sunset. The weather had been beautiful all week, warm but not humid, with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze. It was hard to believe that just 6 months ago we had been boarding up windows and preparing for a hurricane. "You know what I was thinking about today?" Patricia said, swirling the wine in her glass. "What?" how differently that night could have gone. If you had not had those flares in your car, Brenda might not have come over. She might not have stolen them. She might not have driven in the storm and gotten caught with all that stolen property. Butterfly effect, I said. One small decision leading to massive consequences. Do you think she ever thinks about that? About how her whole life unraveled because she could not let go of some petty HOA rule? I considered the question. I think people like Brenda convince themselves they are always in the right. Even now, sitting in prison, she probably still thinks she was just doing her job. That is what makes them dangerous. They are so convinced of their own righteousness that they can justify anything. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from orange to pink to purple. Somewhere in the neighborhood, kids were playing street hockey, their shouts and laughter carrying on the breeze. A normal Saturday evening in a normal suburban neighborhood. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and saw it was from the Victim Services Coordinator at the courthouse. Restitution payment received, I read aloud. $25 toward your claim. Patricia raised her eyebrows. She is actually making payments, looks like it. At this rate, she will have me paid back in about 8 years. Better than nothing, I suppose. I set the phone aside and picked up my own glass of wine. You know what? I do not even care about the money anymore. I just care that we are safe, the neighborhood is back to normal, and we do not have to deal with HOA Karen anymore. I will drink to that, Patricia said, clinking her glass against mine. Over the next year, life continued its steady rhythm. I got a promotion at work. Patricia started volunteering at the local animal shelter. We took a vacation to the mountains and talked about maybe trying to start a family. The incident with Brenda and the stolen flares became just another story we told at dinner parties, a crazy chapter in our lives that had fortunately reached a conclusion. I did attend one more HOA meeting, about 1.5 years after Brenda's sentencing. Margaret had invited me specifically because the board was voting on a proposal to install emergency call boxes at key intersections throughout the neighborhood. The idea was that in the event of another hurricane or major emergency, residents would have a way to communicate even if cell towers went down. We are calling it the Community Safety Initiative, Margaret explained to the assembled homeowners. We have already secured a grant from the county that will cover 60% of the installation costs. The remaining 40% would come from a one-time special assessment of $75 per household. A few people grumbled about the cost, but most seemed supportive. After some discussion, the motion passed by a wide margin. As people filed out of the community center, several neighbors stopped to shake my hand and thank me for my testimony at Brenda's trial. "You really stood up to her," one woman said. "A lot of people were too intimidated to challenge her over the years. Maybe if more of us had pushed back earlier, it never would have gotten this bad." I did not know how to respond to that. The truth was, I had not set out to be any kind of hero. I had just refused to let someone bully me into giving up my property. The fact that it had led to exposing a much larger criminal enterprise was almost accidental. Tom caught up with me in the parking lot. "Hey, did you hear? The state parole board denied Brenda's early release petition. She's going to serve at least another 2 years. I had not heard that, I said. When did she file for parole? Last month. Her attorney argued she had been a model prisoner and completed some kind of rehabilitation program. But the board said the severity of the crimes and the number of victims meant she needed to serve more time. I nodded slowly. A part of me felt bad for Brenda, spending years in prison for what had started as an overzealous attempt to enforce HOA rules. But then, I remembered the fear in Patricia's eyes that night when we did not know how bad the storm would get, and how Brenda had chosen that moment of vulnerability to commit her crimes. My sympathy evaporated quickly. "Anyway," Tom continued, "I wanted to let you know that Bailey is having puppies next month. If you and Patricia are still interested in getting a dog, we are going to need to find homes for them." "I will talk to Patricia," I said. "She has been wanting a dog for years." That conversation led to us adopting a golden retriever puppy we named Scout. He became the center of our lives, demanding attention and long walks through the neighborhood. Those walks often took me past the intersection where Brenda had stranded her car that stormy night, where my flares had burned bright red in the darkness. The intersection looked completely normal now, just another corner in a quiet suburban development. Sometimes I wondered what Brenda thought about during her time in prison. Did she replay that night over and over, wishing she had made different choices? Did she recognize the moment when her life veered off course, when her obsession with rules and authority had twisted into something criminal? Or did she still see herself as a victim, unfairly punished for trying to do her job? I would never know the answers to those questions, and honestly, I did not need to. My story with HOA Karen had reached its conclusion. Justice had been served, restitution was being paid, and life had moved on. The emergency flares I had replaced sat in my trunk, ready for any future crisis, but hopefully never to be needed. And whenever I checked them during routine car maintenance, I thought about how such a simple piece of safety equipment had become the catalyst for exposing a neighborhood criminal. 2.5 years after the storm, Patricia and I were featured in a local news story about hurricane preparedness. The reporter wanted to talk to people who had lived through the previous major storm and could offer advice to new residents. We demonstrated our emergency supplies, including the famous flares, and talked about the importance of having a plan. During the interview, the reporter asked if I had heard what happened to Brenda Whitmore, the former HOA president who had gone to prison for the storm night thefts. "Last I heard, she was still serving her sentence," I said carefully. "I think she has about 1.5 years left before she is eligible for parole again." "Do you think justice was served in her case?" I thought about how to answer that. "I think she committed serious crimes and received an appropriate punishment. What happened to her was a direct result of her own choices. She could have stayed home that night. She could have called for help when her car got stranded. She could have been honest with the police when they pulled her over. Instead, she made a series of bad decisions that hurt a lot of people. The legal system held her accountable for that. Do you think she will reoffend when she gets out?" "I have no idea," I said honestly. "I hope she learned something from the experience, but that is up to her." The news segment aired a few weeks later, right as hurricane season was beginning again. We got several calls and messages from friends who saw it, including a few people from the old neighborhood. Margaret, the HOA president, sent a nice email thanking us for representing Magnolia Springs in a positive light. Life continued its forward motion. Patricia got promoted to supervisor at the animal shelter. Scout grew from a clumsy puppy into a dignified adult dog. The neighborhood installed the emergency call boxes, which thankfully went unused. And the quarterly restitution payments from Brenda Whitmore continued to arrive like clockwork. $25 at a time, a slow drip of accountability that would continue for years to come. About 3 years after the trial, I received a letter in the mail with a return address from the North Carolina Department of Corrections. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single handwritten page on prison stationery. "Dear Isaac," it began, "I know you probably do not want to hear from me, and I understand if you throw this letter away without reading it. But my therapist suggested that I write to the people I hurt, not to ask for forgiveness, but to take full responsibility for my actions. The letter continued for 2 pages, detailing Brenda's recognition of how wrong she had been and how much damage she had caused. She wrote about the rehabilitation programs she had completed and her plans for when she was released. She mentioned that she had been working in the prison library and had started taking college courses online, working toward a degree in social work. "I know I can never undo the harm I caused," the letter concluded. "I know I destroyed trust and hurt people who were simply trying to live their lives. All I can do is try to be better going forward. I am not asking for your forgiveness or even your response. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did was wrong, and I take full responsibility. I hope you and your family are well." It was signed simply Brenda. I showed the letter to Patricia that evening. She read it carefully, her expression thoughtful. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think she is probably sincere," Patricia said. "Prison does change people, sometimes for the better, but sincerity does not erase what she did." "Should I write back?" Patricia handed me the letter. "That is up to you. There is no wrong answer here." I thought about it for several days. Part of me wanted to respond with something encouraging, to acknowledge her efforts at rehabilitation. But another part of me felt that doing so would minimize the harm she had caused. In the end, I decided not to reply. Brenda's redemption, if it was real, could not depend on validation from her victims. She had to find it within herself. I filed the letter away in a folder with all the other documents from the case and tried not to think about it. But every time a restitution payment arrived, I remembered those handwritten words and wondered if Brenda was truly a different person now, or if she was simply better at saying what people wanted to hear. 4 years after that storm-tossed night when everything began, Brenda was released from prison on parole. I learned about it through the victim notification system, which sent me an automated message with the details of her release conditions. She was required to maintain employment, attend regular counseling sessions, and stay at least 500 feet away from Magnolia Springs subdivision and all her former victims. A few weeks later, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Brenda had moved to a small town about 2 hours west, near the Virginia border. She had found work at a domestic violence shelter, helping women who were trying to rebuild their lives after leaving abusive situations. The irony was not lost on me that someone who had once wielded power so destructively was now helping others escape from people who did the same thing. Tom brought it up during one of our occasional weekend conversations. "You think she has really changed?" "Maybe," I said, watching Scout chase a tennis ball across the yard. "Or maybe she just learned to direct her controlling tendencies into something more socially acceptable. Does it matter? I guess not, as long as she leaves us alone, and she did leave us alone." The years passed, and Brenda Whitmore faded from a vivid presence in our lives to a cautionary tale we occasionally mentioned when new neighbors moved in and asked about the HOA. The restitution payments continued until finally, nearly 7 years after the theft, I received a notice that my claim had been paid in full. $200, paid in $25 increments over 84 months. I thought about framing that final notice, a symbolic end to a bizarre chapter of our lives. But in the end, I just filed it away with all the other documents and moved on. These days, when I do my seasonal car maintenance and check the emergency flares in my trunk, I sometimes think about that night. The howling wind, the rising water, Brenda's desperate face as she demanded I give her my safety equipment. The sound of breaking glass and the wail of the car alarm. the red glow of flares marking her stranded vehicle in the flooded intersection. But mostly, I think about the choices we all make and how they ripple outward in ways we cannot predict. If I had just given Brenda the flares that night, would she still have driven in the storm? Would she still have been pulled over with a car full of stolen property? Would her life have taken a different trajectory? Or was she already on that path, her criminal behavior just waiting for the right circumstances to emerge? Maybe the storm was not the cause but merely the catalyst, revealing what had always been there beneath the surface. I do not have answers to those questions. What I do know is that standing up for myself that night, refusing to be bullied into surrendering my property, set in motion a chain of events that protected other people from future harm. Brenda had been escalating her abuse of HOA authority for years, and if not for the storm and her subsequent arrest, who knows how much worse it might have gotten. Sometimes doing the right thing in the moment has consequences far beyond what we can imagine. Sometimes a simple no to a petty tyrant can change the course of multiple lives. And sometimes a set of emergency flares can illuminate not just a dark intersection, but the darkness in someone's character. Patricia and I still live in Magnolia Springs. We have 2 kids now, a daughter named Emma and a son named Jack. Scout has slowed down in his old age but still enjoys his walks through the neighborhood. The HOA is well managed and responsive to residents' concerns. Property values have steadily increased. It is a good place to raise a family. And in my trunk, carefully stored in their weatherproof case, sit 6 emergency flares. I check them every 6 months, making sure they are ready if we ever need them, because that is what responsible people do. They prepare for emergencies. They take care of themselves and their families. They do not wait for someone else to save them. Those flares have never been used, and I hope they never will be. But they are there, just in case. A quiet reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of preparation and self-reliance can make all the difference. And that standing up to a bully, even over something as simple as emergency road flares, is always worth it. The story of HOA Karen who stole my flares in a storm has become part of neighborhood lore, passed down to new residents as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of choosing good leaders. Children play in the streets where Brenda once prowled looking for property to steal. Families gather for block parties on corners where her crimes began. Life has moved on as it always does. But the lessons remain. Be prepared. Stand your ground. Question authority when it becomes authoritarian. And never, ever let anyone convince you that following the rules is more important than doing what is right. That is what I learned from the night HOA Karen stole my emergency flares in a storm and ended up getting pulled over for hazardous driving with a car full of stolen property. It cost her 6 years of her life and destroyed her reputation forever. But for the rest of us, it was a reminder that sometimes justice does prevail, and that karma has a way of catching up with people who abuse whatever small amount of power they are given. The flares sit in my trunk, waiting and ready, and every time I see them during routine maintenance, I smile and remember that sometimes the simplest acts of preparation and defiance can change everything. Sometimes standing up for yourself protects not just you, but your entire community. And sometimes, a homeowner association, Karen learns the hardest way possible that rules without reason are just tyranny wearing a pastel cardigan.